This is another brilliant poem by Duffy, and because its subject is war photography, it's intensely visual. So we begin in darkness, and this is obviously literal. This is in the days where photographers had to develop their film in the dark, but it's also metaphorical. This is the dark place in the war photographer's mind, because the war photographer is compromised. He's a person who is constantly exposing the horrors of war, but in doing so he has to participate in them, and he also has to ask himself, does he perpetuate them? Do these things happen because he's there? Should he stop them? And also, do his photographs make the world accept things which are unacceptable? One of the earliest war photographic images from the American Civil War. A monk setting himself alight in protest at the Vietnam War. Children fleeing clouds of napalm in the background in Vietnam. They're naked because their clothes have burnt their skin with the napalm and they've torn them off, screaming in terror, but we don't hear them, do we? And this is Kim Phuc, the 9-year-old girl in the photograph you've just seen. She now lives in America and has forgiven that country for the atrocity. And then here another iconic image of a man apparently being executed, taken by different photographers, both of whom recorded the event and obviously did nothing. And that was just their job. And there he is writhing on the floor, perhaps dead. And then there's the voyeurism that intrudes on private grief, images where we just see other people's sorrow, and we don't try to understand it, or if we do, we don't try to stop it. And here's an image of the future. Will that child's children also see war? This is another brilliant poem by Duffy, and because its subject is war photography, it's intensely visual. So we begin in darkness, and this is obviously literal. This is in the days where photographers had to develop their film in the dark, but it's also metaphorical. This is the dark place in the war photographer's mind, because the war photographer is compromised. He's a person who is constantly exposing the horrors of war, but in doing so he has to participate in them, and he also has to ask himself, does he perpetuate them? Do these things happen because he's there? Should he stop them? And also, do his photographs make the world accept things which are unacceptable? The spools are a reference to the way that film was spooled in and out of the camera, and here that's been transposed in the metaphor to spools of suffering, because each image is an image of suffering. And the alliteration, the sibilants of the S's here, which are normally soothing, here I think are used ironically, because it's the opposite of soothing. It's horrifying. And a further possibility is watching the images develop may be soothing to the photographer. They may somehow expunge these images from his mind, as though the photograph takes them out of his body so that he can forget about them. They come out in ordered rows. If you've seen a contact print or a series of negatives, that's exactly how they appear. But the language is also reminiscent of dead soldiers in ordered rows in their graves, and that's obviously deliberate. Death permeates everything. The only light is red. That's a literal description. That stops the images from becoming overexposed. But clearly there's a symbolic association with blood and danger and death. And softly goes, and this word softly with its alliterative S reminds us that this is ironic. It shouldn't be soft. This is horror. As though this were a church, and the full irony is drawn out here, isn't it? This is a place of peace and sanctuary, and this is where the photographer comes to escape the war. But for the people in the images, there is no escape. They're either dead or still dying or suffering. And he, a priest preparing to intone Mass. This may be a swipe out religion that allows war to continue. My father, for example, was born during the first year of the Spanish Civil War, and he grew up in Barcelona, and his father fought on the losing side, the Republican side. But many Republicans during the war actually attacked members of the church and killed priests because the church was so steadfast in its support of the fascist Franco. And so this idea of Catholicism somehow being complicit in war is something that permeated the 20th century, and many people have looked at successive popes and asked, what did you do in the war? Duffy, of course, was raised a Catholic, and this is a question she may well be asking about her own faith and upbringing. And then we have a common trope of Duffy poems, a kind of intonation, a prayer if you like, and here it's ironic. Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh in Cambodia, and these are all scenes of tragedies, and the scale of the tragedy increases. So we have Catholic against Protestant in Belfast, and then we have religious wars in Beirut, and then we have ethnic cleansing in Phnom Penh, millions of people killed, and then the biblical expression, all flesh is grass, again is used ironically. It's a peaceful image, isn't it? And again we've got the sibilance of the S's in flesh and grass, and that sibilance hides genocide. The second verse is also laced with irony. He has a job to do. And is this just a job to him, this reporting? That makes it kind of obscene, doesn't it? At least if it's a calling, he's trying to change the world. But if he's just getting paid to observe people suffering, it's much less acceptable to us. And then this irony here. Solutions slop in trays. And so the solutions literally are solutions to the problems of war. Well, of course, nothing of the sort is occurring here, and that's indicated in the word slop. And we can just hear in that sound how the solution itself has come to a stop. Literally, the solutions are the chemicals, the liquid chemicals used to develop the photographs. Beneath his hands, which did not tremble then. And so this is the first time we have some sympathy for the war photographer. He's obviously trembling now, in contrast to how he performed during the war, during battle. It's as though he's had to shelve all his feelings. And perhaps there's something heroic, not giving in to his fear and emotions at the time, but now he makes room for them in the dark room. Although the word beneath his hands gives us a different twist, as though other people's suffering is beneath him and he can rise above it. And that's carried through in this uncertainty here. They seem to now, and the observer is not entirely sure, and that's us as well, we're not entirely sure just how affected he is by what he's seen. Then the verse leaps into contrast. Rural England, the complete opposite of the kind of images that he's developing. Home again to an ordinary pain. And this gets to the heart perhaps of his motivation. He's obviously trying to escape pain at home, but that pain is ordinary, and he's leaping out towards extraordinary pain. A masochist, or perhaps even a sadist. Either way, we're suspicious of him. He's not like the rest of us. However, he's also unlike the rest of us in that he is incredibly heroic. Abroad, in war, the fields explode beneath the feet. Unlike here, he is, after all, risking his own life each time he goes. And then, of course, there's the running children in a nightmare heat. And that's not just a nightmare that we see in the images, it's one which he actually feels. And there's this idea that perhaps he too is getting too close to this heat. It's affecting him incredibly. And so now in the third verse, something is happening. It's not just the photographs that are developing, but our understanding of the photographer, and perhaps his own. A stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes. This is obviously memory, he's seeing it, and it's also a description of how the image appears to twist, because the fluid is moving across the image and you can see it bend. But also it's almost coming to life, accusing him, a half-formed ghost. He's being haunted by the images he has taken, because he's being haunted by the people. He's starting to remember them, and suddenly it leaps into 3D. He can hear as well as see, and he hears their cries. And also of this man's wife. Perhaps he didn't notice her at first, he was concentrating on the image of the man, and then he sought her approval. He thought of her at the time, but look how he did it, without words. How sincere is that? How easy is it to misinterpret a look and just see what you want to see? Why does he do that? Because he sees it as his duty. He's doing what someone must. Someone's got to report on the crimes of war if war is to be stopped, even though the evidence before our eyes is that wars continue all the time, and how the blood stained into foreign dust. And that's a bit of a cliche, and I think Duffy is pointing out that war itself is a cliche. Cliche is something that we've heard before, but yet is always around, and this of course is ironic. Normally cliches are easily avoided, but here war can never be escaped. And so the final verse begins to hint at his actual pain. The 100 agonies are obviously, literally, the agonies of each of the people in the hundreds of pictures, and that's why they're in black and white. However, there's another meaning to black and white, isn't there? Right and wrong. And he's wrestling with this idea of right and wrong now, and experiencing those agonies himself. Duffy contrasts this to how the editor will react, and the editor will pick out 5 or 6 from the 100, and this starts to seem perhaps obscene to the photographer. And where will they be published? Not on the front page, but in Sunday's supplement. The reader's eyeballs prick, and we think, hang on, maybe something will change here. It's quite a violent image, as though the eyeballs are under attack. They prick with tears, and so the enjambment has led us here to sympathy in the reader. Perhaps these photographs are serving the purpose they're intended to. They are going to change public perception, and public perception may just change the war. But no, there's here this anticlimax, this pathos, between the bath and pre-lunch beers. 2 images of washing away the images themselves. 1 in a bath, and 2 in alcohol. And these are male drinkers, and it's men in this society who have the power, the photographer, the editor, and these men of the public, refuse to exercise that power for good. They simply drink them away. And then in the final 2 lines, he escapes. He stares impassively, without emotion, perhaps preparing himself for his destination, war, but perhaps also because he can no longer feel emotion with the people he doesn't understand, the people at home, the people of England who don't care, where he earns his living and they do not care. And so this is an attack on the British populace, and of course by definition on us, the reader. But set against that is the irony of him earning his living from other people's suffering, their dying, which is contrasted to his living. And so he cannot escape some moral ambiguity, and the question is still there. Should we indulge these pictures? Should we look at them? And if so, what should we do about them? The structure of this is also rather interesting. I've written here the syllables for each line, and you can see that's roughly echoed in the final verse. And if we flip across the page to the good teachers, a very similar pattern emerges with the first verse and also the final verse. They're also similar techniques. So if we look here, these 2-syllable words in a list, and that's echoed back here with Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh. She's dealing in very similar rhythms. A 6-line verse here, 6-line verse here, but what's different is the rhyme scheme. And so we ought to ask, why does she introduce a rhyme scheme here at all? Well, one possibility is rhyme schemes are traditional, and it suits a poem that contains a moral. Other poems are much more ambiguous. Here the ambiguity is, how do we respond to the war photographer? But there's no ambiguity about how we should respond to the photographs. We should be outraged by them, and that seems to me the moral of the poem. And the morality is carried with these final rhyming couplets on every verse, emphasising that there's a lesson here. Without words to do what someone must, and how the blood stained into foreign dust. And we ask, what should we do if we're that someone? And here, from the airplane, he stares impassively at where he earns his living and they do not care. And rhyming couplets are something that Duffy normally runs away from, because she loves the surprise of enjambment and guessing what's coming on the next line. But a rhyming couplet actually links the end of each line to each other. It's got a very tum-ti-tum rhythm, which would normally undermine the surprise in her poetry. But here, she's not after surprise, she's after a moral lesson, and it's one that we may or may not learn. How did you do looking at the images of war? Did they affect you? Did it make you want to change war? Or were they just yet more images that you're exposed to hundreds of times a day? Mildly interesting, but not that shocking.